Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp LaRouche. It's June 4th, 2020. As most of you are well aware, we're in the midst of a period of intense chaos in the United States. A lot of things going on, a lot of battles being fought, many of which have very little to do with the real problems in the world, but are being deployed to disrupt and disorient people. I guess we should start, Helga, with the riots, which have been at the forefront of most people's attention from the last days. What's your sense of what's happening there?
Well, is is there a baby crying? Uh, well, I think the um, situation in the United States is extremely um, tense. I think a long simmering conflict has erupted in the open, and that is the fact that you do have an incredible racial division. And I know from my own experience in the United States that the fact is that you have a white world and you have a Afro-American world or a black world. So what happened in Minnesota is obviously the most disgusting expression of that. I mean, the picture of this man under the knee of this police officer will may have the same significance than the famous My Lai picture about Vietnam, because it symbolizes something which absolutely has to be remedied and gotten rid of. Now, obviously, what erupted afterwards was a genuine uh, disgust and upsetness by a lot of people, not only black people but also many white people, and there were and still are absolutely legitimate demonstrations. But obviously, what was mixed in very quickly was that these demonstrations were hijacked by a whole bunch of different groupings, by the Antifa, but also white supremacist groups, and also we are looking into professional uh, riot instigators, because we saw and had many reports from different cities when this was in over 70 cities. So this is not a small thing, where you had people who were walking, were using the bullhorn and then would go into side alleys directing the way how the looting should occur with walkie-talkies. So this has a quite professional aspect, and many of the mayors actually said that the violence and the looting occurred from outsiders. So this is obviously a problem which needs to be investigated. And I think that then when President Trump evoked the the Insurrection Act of 1807, basically saying that if the governors cannot get it under control, that he will call in the military. This then caused a whole storm, by the Democrats, by the media. Internationally, this was oil on the fire. But in the meantime, President Trump said that that situation is not yet there. And obviously, then you had another wave by both Secretary of Defense Esper and also former Secretary of Defense Mattis attacking Trump, and that was then again picked up by the Democrats in. So I'm only touching upon all of these things to make a point that one has to be aware that what is going on is a very complex situation. What is erupting is a long-standing injustice of the United States, uh, but there's also the ongoing British coup against President Trump. And I think when you evaluate all of these things, it is very important to not mix up things, because it is very complex. There is already a clear direction where the way out will be. That is, you have to go into a complete different geometry, which was at the same time ironically expressed by the successful launch of the rocket between NASA and SpaceX, bringing 2 astronauts again after a long hiatus to the space station. And that also had the potential of a positive cooperation between NASA and Roscosmos, therefore showing the direction in a positive collaboration for the future between the United States and Russia. So I think one has to consider all of these elements and more, because it is a very complex situation. But I think it is obviously crying for a change of the paradigm, the absolute need to establish an international credit system which would allow to address all of these problems, including that what many Black people experience as a complete injustice to their life. And that is why we are mobilizing to put a completely different agenda on the table, centered around the creation of 1.5 billion productive jobs, 50 million productive new jobs in the United States, and to actually carry out a global development program. The new Silk Road must become the world land bridge. So this may sound like a lot of different subjects and elements, but the situation is complex. And I think it is important to see it in that complexity, because if you are, Johnny One Note and only address one issue, you miss the complex picture and also therefore the correct solution.
What makes it even more confusing for people is the media spin. Instead of focusing on some of the key developments which you just presented, or we're going to take up in the talk today, including what's happening with the economy, which is pretty much left out. We're having the biggest bailout in world history, and that's not even brought up in discussion. But at the same time, remember, all of this occurred in the midst of a counter-coup. And the counter-coup was the expose of the illegal actions that were involved in Russiagate, Ukrainegate, and so on. And yesterday, very significant, the Senate Intelligence Committee heard from Rod Rosenstein. What's your sense of the importance of this in the context of the continuing attempt to get rid of Donald Trump?
Well, that is very interesting, because while Rosenstein, behaved like the 3 monkeys who hide their eyes and ears and don't speak as well. I mean, he pretended that he was completely out of it. I mean, after all, he was the deputy attorney general, and he was the person who appointed special counselor or special investigator Robert Mueller. He basically claimed that he didn't know what he was doing, and had no real knowledge, and that it was all the fault of the FBI. And then he blamed a former deputy director of the FBI, McCabe, only for this guy McCabe to then turn around and call Rosenstein a liar. That basically he knew very well what he was doing. So I think this is creating a whole bunch of leads for further investigation. I mean, after all, we now know that the entire intelligence apparatus of the Obama administration knew by the beginning of 2017, and probably given that they were pretty much active before in 2016, that the whole accusation of Russiagate was a complete lie, that the Steele dossier was a phony concoction by British intelligence. And this is now all open for investigation. Now, President Trump himself has talked already about Obama game, and naturally, Obama Gate, I'm sorry. And naturally, the big question is, what did Obama know when, and what was his role in all of this? But obviously, the role of British intelligence in setting up this entire coup, as it was announced in the British paper The Spectator already in January 2017, where they had a headline that they would try to get Trump out one way or another, either through assassination, a coup, or impeachment. And that has been behind all of this for the whole time. So this is now being subject of an investigation in the Senate. I think there are flaws in it because Lindsey Graham is still somehow, sticking to the line that there was some Russian involvement, which clearly there was not. But I think the contradictions between the Department of Justice, Rosenstein, and the FBI perpetrators will lead to further investigation, and it could really finish off this entire coup and bring the guilty ones to the forefront. And that would be sort of a catharsis of the whole situation. And it would be an eye-opener for all the people who are absolutely hyping themselves up against Trump all the time, to recognize that they were misled by a destabilization operation by the British intelligence, which is a very important component of what people normally, in a very shortened way, call the deep state. So this is now coming out, and therefore, it's getting very, very interesting.
Well, one of the areas where it's especially interesting is US-China relations, where we've seen a series of developments in the last few days. The media is playing it as an escalation toward a new Cold War, but very little attention is being paid to what you just pointed out, which is the same people behind Russiagate are now attacking the possibility of a US-China relationship. And just in the last day or so, who jumps back into the middle of this but Sir Richard Dearlove, the man who provided the dossier on the weapons of mass destruction that led to the Iraq War, the same man who vouched for Christopher Steele and his dossier against Trump. How does Dearlove and the British fit into this China question?
Well, he came out, and he, after all, is the former head of MI6, um, and basically said that the virus, coronavirus, was made by the Chinese in a Chinese lab, and that is the reason why the Chinese must pay reparation to the whole world for the damage which caused by the virus. Now, I think this is incredible because there is in a certain sense, an overwhelming, um, uh, you know, agreement among scientists from around the world that this virus is uh, an organic virus. And what made it a pandemic, we have documented for half a century that what caused the virus to cause a pandemic is not the virus. It is the fact that the neoliberal economic model for half a century lowered the living standard of so many people around the world that it does have the potential to spread in this uncontrolled way, as we see now. So, in an absolute horrible way in Africa, where the African CDC is reporting that it is now community transmitted, which means it's almost impossible to defeat, given the fact that the health system in Africa is practically not existing. You have an absolute raving outbreak in Brazil, which is now becoming the absolute hotspot, like Chile, like Ecuador. But these countries don't have the ability to do what China did. China did not let it to become a pandemic because they were able to quell it through very rigorous methods in the first 2 months. And they just did a testing of the entire population of Wuhan, almost 10 million people, and they had basically no cases anymore. They had some symptomatic cases, but they were not contagious. So it is possible to contain and stop such a virus outbreak. But naturally, what makes it a pandemic is when you have entire continents who are absolutely not equipped to deal with it, or if you have a population which is so hedonistic that they don't agree to the kinds of measures which were taken in China. So for Sir Richard Dearlove to put out such a statement is a really incredibly inciting, trying to, this goes beyond a Cold War statement. This is actually, creating an enemy image for a real confrontation with China. So I think, the role of the British intelligence in the coup against Trump, in the anti-China campaign, coming from one and the same sources, should get people to think about it.
One side note or footnote to the Dearlove claims is typical of British intelligence. It was a British doctor and a Norwegian researcher. The Norwegian researcher has withdrawn his name from the study. So even the study that he's citing is dubious, to say the least. Now, you mentioned China with the testing in Wuhan and elsewhere. They just had their party congress and the People's Assembly. What is the approach coming from China to the economic situation? How are they planning to rebuild?
Well, first of all, Xi Jinping just met with a whole group of experts to review the outbreak of the coronavirus and learn the lessons. He said that there was some confusion in the first week, uh, and that means, that the health system has to be still improved, that the medical research has to be upgraded. But he said that the most important thing is that they put life above everything, that they treated everybody with the same absolute determination to save life, from the newborn to the over 100-year-old people, and that especially the elderly had to be absolutely protected, not to pay attention to cost. And I think this is a very important aspect, because if you're here to hear certain Western politicians who say, that life is not the most important, and there should be a opening up quickly, and there should be even the Swedish model, which basically is the herd immunity model, which was correctly attacked by Chinese, among others, as being absolutely cynical for taking into account or willing to take the loss of many people's life. So I think that China is now continuing to rebuild its economy with absolute emphasis on infrastructure, continuing with the projects of the Belt and Road Initiative. And just today, there was an important economist in CGTN by commenting on this whole discussion about the decoupling, that some people in the United States in particular are talking about decoupling the US economy and China. And this economist, Ding Yifan, basically said that the West will do it at their own losses, because the idea that if the United States and Europe would disengage from globalization, that would not have an effect on China and the emerging countries, who together would have bypassed the G7 already 2 years ago. Now, I find this very interesting, because it is actually true that the idea of somehow isolating China will not function. I mean, the only thing you have left is nuclear war, which will mean that even those people who would start it would not survive it. Because if you have nuclear war, then that's in all likelihood the end of civilization. But short of that, there is no way how you can stop the rise of China. And they have now basically engaged with many other countries in these projects. So, obviously, the big question is what will come out of this battle? What kind of an order will emerge? And what will be the world looking like in the post-pandemic world? And I think that is the really crucial battle going on behind the scenes already now.
I think that's what we have to talk about now, the big battle that's emerging. On the one hand, you have a whole series of triggers that could lead to an even more explosive blowout with the Argentina being declared in default, the coming wave of evictions and maybe home foreclosures in the United States. But at the same time, you have the really big battle, Helga. On the one side, the bankers pushing for a Green New Deal, a global Green New Deal, versus the idea that we have put forward of an emphasis on physical economy based on science and technology. How do you see this battle shaping up?
Well, I think, it really is the most important question because, the question is what is creating the basis for the existence of the human species over a longer period of time. And, what is being pushed right now by the central banks coming from the Jackson Hole bankers meeting last year, the proposals by Mark Carney, uh, and the other central bankers, by the ECB, by the EU Commission, the Green New Deal by Ursula von der Leyen, and various proposals also coming from the preparatory meeting of the World Economic Forum for next year in Davos, the Great Reset, they call it. Um, all of these institutions I just named, they want to use this crisis to impose their green agenda, which means total decarbonization of the world economy, mostly get rid of nuclear energy and redirect financial investments only in such a way that green projects would be financed. Now, it is really a problem because most people think that all these stimulus programs which are now being put on the agenda, the 750 billion proposal by Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, which probably will have to be reduced to 600 billion because a lot of European countries don't want to be a part of it. Then you have the various proposals for bailouts of various kinds. But some people think this is positive, but if it's green, it is completely destructive. And you have a situation where the real economy is already massively hit by the pandemic. You had almost half of the labor force and productive capacity worldwide shut down. Now it's being loosened up. But you have now 50 million unemployed in the United States. You have a almost 30% collapse of the real economy in most European countries. So if you impose on that very dire economic situation still a green agenda by going into low energy flux densities like solar and wind energy, you are destroying the productive capacity of the world economy. And that is actually intended because if you look at the proponents of this is coming from such people as, again, the British Empire, the Schellenhuber proposals of several years ago for the great transformation of the world economy. There is, and that has been the one of the absolute outstanding contributions of my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, there is a direct correlation between the energy flux density in the production process and the number of people which can be maintained. So if you go to very low energy flux densities like in solar and wind, it means the potential of the world is only 1 billion, maybe 2 billion, but for sure not the 7, 8 billion we are having now, and soon 9 billion. And it would mean a complete reduction of the population. And that's what some of these people really have as their agenda. So that has to be absolutely understood. And what we are proposing is the opposite. We propose energy flux densities to increase beyond fossil fuels, to go to nuclear energy, and naturally to have a crash program for fusion energy. And then you need to basically completely adjust the world economy to the principles of physical economy. And that has everything to do with the fact that the only source of wealth is not raw materials, it's not free trade, it's not buying cheap, selling expensive, But the only source of wealth is the creative power of the human mind, the ability of the human being to again and again discover physical principles of the universe. This is called scientific progress, to turn that into technological advances and apply those in the production. And that way you increase the population potential for the entire world population. And that is why we have proposed this 1.5 billion job creation program, which must be the answer to the present crisis, because unless you address the issue of poverty alleviation in Africa, in Latin America, in those areas in the United States and Europe which do suffer poverty, there is no way how you can solve these problems. You cannot get social peace. You don't fight the pandemic. You can't fight the famine, which is looming very, very big. So the only way how you address all of these issues is you have to increase production and create the conditions for the livelihood of all the people who are living on this planet. And that must be the passionate desire of everybody who wants to solve this present crisis.
And what you just described is what you've called the new paradigm, the move toward address the common aims of mankind for the future. But there's a problem here, which is that we just had a return of the United States to space for the first time in 9 years. And even some people who are relatively decent, who understand the importance of fighting the coup in the United States, who oppose the bailouts, still have this distorted view which says spending money in space exploration is a waste of money. How does the space program fit in with what you were just discussing about human creativity and the real source of wealth?
Well, one can take it on the pragmatic level, that it is well known that for every cent invested in the Apollo program, there was a 14-cent return in the civilian economy. And all the people who like the internet and who like their laptop, they really thank that to the Apollo program, because that was where all these inventions from computer chips to all kinds of other things we are still using today were discovered. But I don't want to leave it at that pragmatic level, because if you look at the long arc of human civilization, it was always fundamental discoveries of new principles, which made it possible for the human species to develop and to progress and to increase the population density from a couple of millions in the Stone Age to presently we can easily populate the world. And if you would apply all the technologies we have, we could make actually a garden Eden out of this planet already. But new principles concerning our physical universe, to bring a human being from above the Earth into orbit. This was a gigantic step. Um, I think that the idea of colonizing the moon, industrializing the moon as a sort of takeoff station to build a city on Mars, to do terraforming on Mars, and take that as a step for in future generations interstellar flight and finding out how our universe works. That is what distinguishes us from the animals. I mean, there are many people who love dogs and cats and birds, but none of these animal species ever has changed their mode of existence. No cat can breed mice to have better breakfast. They have to sit in front of the hole and wait until the mouse comes out, or not. Uh, I think human beings are capable of, behaving like, the astronauts, and they have the relations. If you look at how the American and the Russian astronauts cooperate on the ISS, they don't have fights. They have to cooperate on the basis of reason, and that is the model for the future cooperation of mankind. Now, I think it's very good that President Trump wants to expand the G7 to invite Putin to attend, and also India and some other countries. But I think the response by Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman from the foreign ministry of the Russian foreign ministry, she said that it does not make sense not to invite China because there are no problems, not global problems, which can be solved without the participation of China. So I would hope that, you know, the kind of cooperation which is now fortunately happening between Roscosmos and NASA, and the idea is that Russian astronauts will, you know, travel in the future with American space carriers and vice versa. That is the kind of cooperation for the future existence of mankind. Because if you look at the world as it is right now, you have these riots, you have anxiety, you have people jobless, you have people in poverty. I mean, the world is in such a terrible condition. And everybody who sees that, you know, sees it cannot continue like that. And, you know, many people are fearful. What does the future bring? Well, there is a way to solve all of these problems, and that is that we have to make the next step in the evolution of mankind, and that is the international cooperation in space travel, in space exploration, and to solve the common aims of mankind, which includes emphatically the defeat or the defense against asteroids. I think just this week, 5 major asteroids will somehow pass by. The closest one will be just beyond the moon, and it will be 108 feet wide. So this is not a small thing at all, and we don't know yet how to defend the planet against such asteroids, which sometimes, you know, like comets even more, appear extremely rapidly, and we don't plan for these things now together. Then, you know, it may be too late one point, and we may have an impact of one of these comets or asteroids, and that can have devastating consequences for the entire human species. Poverty alleviation, defense against asteroids, finding out the mysteries of the universe. These are things which unite us as one human species. And I think we are at the point where either we rise to this uh, recognition that the one mankind is of a higher priority than the many, or we may not exist. So I'm optimistic that the very important step was done with the space launch, and it reminds people of what it means, you know, to have an optimistic perspective for the future of all of mankind. But we need urgently to introduce a new level of thinking, a new paradigm. And, you know, what we have proposed for a very long time, the 4 laws of Lyndon LaRouche, his proposals, you know, to have a world development program, the World Land Bridge, for which he passionately fought for his entire life, that is now the way to go, and that has to be put on the agenda. And I would ask all of you to help to get this discussion and implement it as soon as possible. There is not much time to lose.
And I would urge all of our viewers to go to the LaRouchePact.com website and download the program, the 1.5 billion new productive jobs, study it, discuss it, and take to heart what Helga just laid out in terms of the passionate commitment of man to create a better future. Most of you I know want to do that. And the question in these chaotic times is, where do you start? And you can't start from the small and build up. You have to start from the big picture. And Helga, I think you gave us a very good view of the big picture today. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing?
No, I think people should, you know, not lose faith that the human creativity can solve all problems when we work together for a good plan. And if you have that confidence and look at your fellow citizens from that standpoint, you discover the creativity in the other person, and not the, you know, what you don't like and the many problems you see. But you have to have an idea that the human relations must be one of a creative species. And if you have that approach, every problem can be solved.
Well, Helga, thank you very much. And conditions hopefully will be improving, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.